Hello guys and welcome back to my channel again. Today we are going to learn about how we can set up authentication to our REST API endpoints, right? So if you have your REST API running on any of the server and it's open to all, anybody can access your REST API without any credentials, right? And that is obviously not that you want, right? You want your REST API to be secured and restricted to some amount of people who actually needs it. Right. For that, you need to have an authentication setup on your sensitive endpoints which are using sensitive informations. We will learn how we can set up authentication on a particular endpoint or a multiple endpoint of your REST API. In the last video of REST API section, we learned how we can set up the basic API endpoints without authentication. With the URL of that particular endpoint, anybody can access it in the network, right? But that is obviously not safe. So what we'll do, we need to have some credential setup or an authentication setup to the endpoint where you need restriction, right? So while sending a request to REST API, you need to also send the username and password along with your data or parameters, whatever you are querying. And if the credential is present, then only your file or whatever thing you want to do that get processed. So let's see how we can do that in our practical example, continuing what we have done in the last video. If you haven't seen the last video, please click on the right corner mark on the video so you can see what we have done in the last video.
Are you looking for learning in networking and automation both at a time, or for a cross-domain knowledge to switch the career? This channel is for you. We also provide cool life hacks with use of Python programming. Press subscribe button and bell icon below to get updates on every new video on the channel.
Okay, so if you can see, this is our main.py that we used in our last video to create two endpoints, home and home version. Now I have added this security thing in the existing code that is for credentials, how we can authenticate in particular APIs. So what we are doing, let's go through what we are doing in this particular function authenticate. Setting up a credential, a parameter as an input, and it's of type of HTTP basic credential. There are multiple class or types for credential. If you see in Fast API security, there are HTTP basic credential, there is HTTP authorization credentials that uses token, there is HTTP bearer as well. It's kind of bearer token that we need to use in this particular class. But for now, I'll be keeping simple basic credentials like username and password, right? And then we can discuss about how we can use or how we can set up tokens as well in the next video. So what we are defining a credential as a parameter with a username and password, and it is depending on this security variable, right? So this security variable is nothing but HTTP basic class, right? That class, we need to define this particular variable because we need to define our username and password. That is why we need to use HTTP basic. If you want to use a token, bearer token, here you can use HTTP bearer, right? And then use the same security variable in this depends function. This depends means that whenever this function will run, it should have this particular variable first, security, then only this function will run. So this function is depending on the security variable. We are also importing all this thing from Fast API. We are importing depends from Fast API. We are importing basic credentials and those kind of things from Fast API.security. So just to keep this in mind, you need to also import these methods and classes before using it. Now in the function, what we are expecting to do, right? So what we are doing is we are comparing the username and password that is entered with whatever username and password is correct. So for now, what I have added is the username should be tag geek and the password should be simple password to authenticate, right? If this is the case, then it will be authenticated. Otherwise, it will raise an exception, HTTP exception, which says 404, that there is a HTTP code between range 400 to 500. That means your API call failed, right? So 404 means not found, and the detailed message that we want to show to user that your credential whatever you are entering is incorrect, right? Now, how do we make sure that this particular authenticate function will run over our endpoint? So let's say whenever I want /home to be authenticated, then only it can be seen by the user, right? So what I'll do, I'll just add dependencies here, and it is an iterable means it should be a list or a tuple, whatever. So I'll just add a sequence, right, as it is mentioned here in the pylint, right? So you can put a list and then you can use depends, and it depends on this authenticate function, right? And I will save it. So this means nobody can access this /home endpoint without these credentials. If they want to try without this credential, they will have the credential is incorrect or not authenticate message showing, right? And only if they authenticate correctly, then only they will see this data whatever we are populating inside the endpoint, right? I also have another endpoint that is /home/version, but that is not depending on authenticate, so that is open to all the users and no authentication is required to run this particular endpoint. Let's see now by running this particular code and seeing what is the output in actual REST API call. So what I'll do, I'll just run uvcon and I will access this in the Chrome. So I will put 127 ran on 5000, right? And I will put /docs. This will take us to Swagger UI. And now you see here you are seeing authorize button, right? By clicking on it, you are prompting for username and password that you want to enter. So for now, I will enter ABCD. Password is also same ABCD. I'll try to authorize. So it is showing that you are already logged in with this ABCD username and password. And now if I try to run this code, right, you're also seeing here this particular endpoint have credential mark over here. That means you need to get authorized before trying this out. So let me try this out and execute. Okay, now what it is saying, it is saying 404 error not found. That means your credential whatever you entered is incorrect, and this is quite same error message that we are populating inside the authenticate function. So it means whenever we are running this /home, it is running this authenticate, right? Now let's say if we try our correct username and password, TechGeek, and password is password. I will authorize it, close it, and now execute it. And you are seeing the status code 200, that is successful, and you are seeing the message, this is my first message in home page. Fine. So this is about /home. This one you are seeing, if I log out now and try to run this home version, so I'll put 1 and it is coming, this is version 1. So it does not need any of the authentication because we haven't entered these dependencies in this particular endpoint. That is why it is open to all. Now there is one more thing. This is about Swagger UI, right? But if you try to run this without Swagger UI, just try to do API call 5000 and home, not slash here. Okay, so it is prompting you for username and password inside this as well. So I'll put tag gig and I'll put password, and now you are seeing the message. This is my first message. So this way you can secure any of the endpoint you want with username and password. You can also modify this conditional checks that we have entered. What you can do, you can put another file containing all the username and passwords, and you can run through them, check that if the username is from it and the password is correct, then only you return the credential or whatever it is. Otherwise you raise an exception, right? So this way you can secure any of the endpoint in your REST API. Hope this is some useful information to you, and if it is, please subscribe to my channel for more such videos. Thank you.